Okay, friends, so here we're going to learn about factoring by grouping. If you're watching this video, it's because this is what you didn't do so well with on that factoring pretest. And in our next unit on polynomials, we're going to need to know how to factor and manipulate equations a little bit more than even we did this first unit. So when we factor by grouping, what we are doing basically we're gonna basically be grouping our four terms in sets of two. So factor by grouping is only really ever used with four terms. So here we go. We've got four terms. I can group them into sets of two. So I'm going to group my first two and then my last two. And then I'm just going to look for greatest common factor between just the first two terms. So between like 3x squared and 6x, the greatest common factor is 3x. That is the biggest number that I can divide out of both terms, or the biggest expression, because x is really not a number. So 3x squared divided by 3x is x. Negative 6x divided by 3 is negative 2. And we're going to do the same thing for the second one. The GCF between 4x and 8 is just 4. 4x divided by 4 is x. Hold up. 8. Negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2. The big idea with this is that we want to make sure that this polynomial and that polynomial are exactly the same, or those binomials are exactly the same. So what happens here is that binomial is one of my factors. So one of my factors is going to be x minus 2, and then I have the variables up front, or the expressions up front, create my next factor. So 3x plus 4 is what's in front. They come together to create our second factor. So if I were to multiply x minus 2 times 3x plus 4, I would get 3x squared minus 6x plus 4x minus 8. For the second one, let's do the same thing. We're going to group the first two and then the last two. 2x to the third minus x squared. I can't pull out a number, but I can pull out an x squared. 2x to the third divided by x squared is x. Negative x squared over x squared is negative 1. Over here, more often than not, whenever we have a negative in front here, we're going to want to pull out a negative version of something. We can always double check to see if it makes sense to do that or not. In this case, it does, and I'll kind of show you why here in a little bit. Between 6 and 3, I am going to pull out a negative 3. Negative 6x divided by negative 3 is a positive 2x. 3 divided by negative 3 is a negative 1. And here, if we notice, x minus 1 and 2x minus 1, I made a mistake somewhere. So let's go back and double check this. 2x to the third divided by x squared is a 2x, not an x. So, oops. It's always good to double check. Those two need to be exactly the same. So if I had not pulled out a negative 3 here, I would have ended up with a negative 2x plus 1, which is fine, except it doesn't match perfectly. So that's why I pulled out the negative 3. So I'm going to do 2x minus 1 is one factor. That little x squared and that minus 3 come together to create my second factor. And it is always good to double check to make sure this one can't be factored any further, and it cannot be. Okay, looking at number 3, this one's a little bit tricky on a couple different accounts, or I guess a couple different reasons. If I were to leave it as is and group them between, like, there's nothing in common with these first two terms, and there's nothing in common with the last two terms. So we wouldn't be able to get that binomial that is exactly the same in both. So we're going to rearrange our terms a little bit. Usually when we are rearranging terms, we can go ahead and just flip-flop your two middle terms. So that's what I'm going to do. You really could put any of them in whatever order you want to. As long as you keep the correct sign in front of them, it doesn't matter if you even put this negative 3wz at the beginning or at the end or wherever. It doesn't. You can do whatever you want to do so that you can get something that works. Now when we go ahead and we group our first two terms and our last two terms, I can take out a 2 between 2 and 6, and I can take out a y, because I have an xy and a wy. So here I'm just left with an x minus 3w. So now over here, whenever I pull out, I am going to make sure that I'm left with an x minus 3w or something that's equivalent. So between negative 3 and 1, I can only pull out like a 1. And here, normally I said normally we would take out the negative version of this number, but I want that 3 to be negative because it's negative over here. So let's look at the variables here. Between wz and xz, we can pull out a z. And I am going to pull out just a positive version because, again, I want that negative 3w because it's over here, and I want it to be exactly the same. And then a plus x. X minus 3w and negative 3w plus x are exactly the same. The terms are just switched around. So that's going to be one of my factors. And then the 2y and the z in front of each of those is my other factor. In this last example, it looks kind of funky, but it's not so bad, I promise. We've got 4 terms. If I were to just plain old group them, I've got fractions. It's going to be kind of funky. If I pull out a 1/4 here, I'm not necessarily going to get the same exact binomial over here. We need to do a little bit more work with this. So before you even start factoring by grouping, you should always check for a greatest common factor. And actually, even though it doesn't look like it, but all 4 of these terms can be divided by 1/4, and we can get a whole number as a result. So if I pull out a 1/4 out of all terms, 1/4 x to the third divided by 1/4 is just going to give me an x to the third. Anything over itself is just 1. 3 divided by 1/4 is the same thing as doing 3 times 4, which is just 12. 3/4 divided by 1/4 is going to get me just a 3, because again, that's the same thing as 3/4 times 4. And the 9 divided by 1/4 is 36. If you are not sure about dividing by fractions, you are more than welcome to pop that into your calculator. You can literally type in 1 divided by 4 divided by 1 divided by 4, and it'll figure it out for you. Or 9 divided by 1 divided by 4, and it'll get it correct for you. No worries on that. So let's go ahead. We're going to group the first 2 now and the last 2 and see how we go here. Between x to the third and 12x squared, I can pull out an x squared. I'm left with an x plus 12. 3 and 36, I can pull out a 3, and I am going to be left with an x plus 12. So now my final answer here is I did pull out that 1/4. You've got to include that if you pull out a greatest common factor. My x plus 12 is what's repeated, so it's one factor. X squared plus 3 is my other factor. I know I went through this pretty quickly. However, that being said, you've had this in Algebra 1. You've also had it in Algebra 2. And if you had anything in between there, you've also had it in those classes. So this is literally just a quick refresher, so in case you forgot things from last school year. So that's why I went through it pretty quickly. If you have any extra questions, though, definitely feel free to see me. And next up is your practice, so you can go ahead and practice what we just practiced here.